The banker slammed his fist on the counter so hard the coffee cups rattled off the shelf behind him. "Get her out of my sight," Gerald Pruitt said, loud enough for every soul in the general store to hear. "I don't conduct business with women who can't even conduct themselves." He meant her size. Everyone knew he meant her size. Mabel Harper stood at that counter with $8.40 in her palm, every coin she had left in the world, trying to make a payment on a debt she wasn't even sure was real, and Gerald Pruitt looked at her like she was something stuck to the bottom of his boot. The room went quiet. A woman near the bolts of fabric turned away. The clerk pretended to count nails. No one said a word. Nobody ever said a word. If this story already has your attention, hit that like button right now, and drop your city or country in the comments below so I can see just how far this story travels. Subscribe if you haven't already, and stay with me all the way to the end, because what happens to Mabel Harper across this bitter Montana winter is the kind of story that doesn't let you go. The Callaway Creek General Store smelled like pine resin and coal smoke, and on that particular October afternoon it smelled also like fear, though nobody would have called it that. Mabel Harper had learned to take up as little space as possible when she entered a room. She moved along the walls. She kept her voice low. She had been doing it so long that it felt less like caution and more like instinct, the way a deer moves through open country, always halfway ready to disappear. She had Owen's hand in hers. He was 8 years old and thin in the way that children get thin when meals aren't reliable. Not sickly, just careful with his energy, like a small animal conserving heat. His coat was too short in the sleeves. She had let out every seam she could find, and it still showed 2 inches of wrist when he reached for something. "Stay close," she murmured, not looking down at him because she was already scanning the room the way she always did. Who was watching? Where the exits were? Whether Gerald Pruitt was in today? He was. She felt her stomach drop when she saw him behind the counter, that wide face of his already arranging itself into an expression she knew by heart. Not quite a sneer. Something worse. The look of a man who has decided in advance that you don't matter. She approached anyway. That was the thing about Mabel Harper that most people in Callaway Creek had never bothered to understand. She was frightened most of the time, and she went forward anyway. She'd been doing that since Thomas died and left her with a child, a ruined homestead, and a stack of papers she didn't fully understand. "Mr. Pruitt," she set her coin purse on the counter. "I'd like to make a payment toward the Harper account, $8.40. Pruitt didn't look at the coins. He looked at her, the full sweep of her, top to bottom, and something shifted in his face that made Owen press closer to her leg. "The Harper account," Pruitt repeated, his voice carrying that particular brand of patience that isn't patient at all. "You want to make a payment?" "Yes, sir." "On a debt of $212. I understand it's not the full amount, but I've been working as a laundress and taking in mending, and when I have more, I'll bring more. I just thought—" "You thought?" He said it like it was faintly amusing, like the notion of her thinking was something between touching and absurd. He turned to the clerk beside him, a young man named Wallace, who had the decency to look at the floor. She thought. The room was quiet in that particular way rooms get when nobody wants to be the one who speaks first. Mabel stood very still. She had learned that too. Stillness as a kind of armor. If you didn't move, you didn't give them anything to grab onto. "Mr. Pruitt," she said, "the payment is in good faith. I'd like a receipt." "What you'd like," he said, leaning forward on the counter, "and what you're going to get are 2 different things, Mrs. Harper. That account is past due by more than 14 months. A partial payment doesn't change that." He pushed the coins back across the counter toward her without touching them, like she'd contaminated them somehow. "You do better to think about how you're going to vacate whatever you're currently occupying and stop wasting. She just said she has the money." The voice came from behind her. Mabel turned. There was a man standing near the back wall, holding a tin of coffee he'd apparently been reading the label on. Tall, dark coat worn at the elbows. He hadn't been there when she came in, or maybe he had, and she'd missed him. She was good at missing things when she was already bracing herself. He set the tin on the nearest shelf and walked toward the counter, unhurried, like a man who'd decided something and saw no reason to announce it. "She offered you a payment," the man said to Pruitt, "in legal tender. Your obligation is to accept it and issue a receipt." Pruitt's expression did something complicated. "This is a private matter, Boone." "Then lower your voice next time." The man, Boone, set his own money on the counter. I'll take the coffee, and whatever she's buying. I don't need, Mabel started. I know you don't, he said quietly, without looking at her. He was still watching Pruitt. Receipt for both transactions, Wallace, when you're ready. Wallace wrote the receipt fast, the pen scratching loud in the silence. Pruitt didn't say anything else. He just looked at Mabel the way men like him look at women like her when they're forced to back down. Storing it up, filing it away. The look that says, this isn't over, it's just not today. Outside, the cold hit immediately. The sky had gone the color of old iron, and the wind carried something in it. Not snow yet, but the promise of snow, the smell of it up in the passes. Mabel got 10 steps from the door before the man called Boone came through it behind her. Mrs. Harper. She stopped walking but didn't turn around right away. She was still steadying herself, running through the usual inventory after a scene like that. Was Owen all right? Had she said anything she'd regret? Was she going to cry? She decided she wasn't going to cry, and then she turned. I'm not a charity case, she said. No, he agreed. You're not. I had the money for the payment. I didn't need... I bought the coffee for myself, he said. I was going to buy it anyway. The timing was coincidental. It wasn't, and they both knew it wasn't. And something about the fact that he said it that way, calmly, without making her feel like she needed to perform gratitude, made her look at him more carefully for the first time. Silas Boone was maybe 40, maybe a few years past it, the kind of man who looked like he'd spent most of his life outdoors and had stopped noticing the weather. There was nothing soft about his face, but it wasn't unkind. He was looking at her in a way she couldn't quite categorize, not the way men usually looked at her, which was either with appetite or with that particular pointed absence of interest that was its own kind of cruelty. He was just looking, like she was a problem he was trying to understand. You're the Harper widow, he said. Thomas Harper's wife. I was. I knew Thomas. He said it simply, no eulogy attached to it. We ran cattle together for a season years back, before I bought the Boone Ranch. She filed that away. Thomas had mentioned a Boone, she thought, or maybe she was constructing the memory from nothing. She'd learned not to trust her own recollections from the months after he died, when everything had blurred. I'm sorry for your loss, Boone said. For what it's worth. Thank you. A silence. Owen was watching Boone with the frank assessment children apply to strangers, head tilted slightly, squinting like he was reading fine print. Who are you? Owen asked. Owen, Mabel said. It's fine, Boone said. He crouched down to the boy's level, which was something most adults didn't think to do. I'm Silas. I have a ranch about 9 miles northeast of here, up against the mountain. I've got 800 cattle and more fence than 2 men can manage, and my cook quit in September. Owen processed this. Why did your cook quit? Said the winters were too hard. Are they? Yes, Boone said. They are. He looked up at Mabel. I'm not asking for charity either. I need a cook and a hand to manage the house stores through winter. It's real work, hard work, and I pay fair wages. You and the boy would have your own room in the house, not the bunkhouse. He paused. I heard what Pruitt said in there about vacating. She stiffened. You don't need to... I'm not asking because of that. He stood up again, and his voice didn't change. No extra gentleness, no pity-coating the words. I'm asking because I looked at my supply inventories this morning, and I'm in trouble if I don't get someone who knows what they're doing before the first big snow. Practical reasons, that's all. Mabel looked at him. She was 34 years old, and she'd learned to read people the way you learn to read weather, watching for the tells, the small signs of what's really building up behind the clouds. Thomas had been a good reader of people, and he'd taught her some of it, and what she'd learned on her own since his death had made her sharp in ways she wished it hadn't. She studied Silas Boone for a long moment. I have conditions, she said. Something in his expression shifted. Not surprise, more like adjustment, the way you adjust your weight when the ground turns uneven. All right? Every meal I eat is one I've earned, not given. I don't take handouts, and I don't owe anything for food or shelter that I haven't worked for. If the work doesn't cover both, I'd rather know that up front. The work will cover both, he said, with wages besides. If I'm not what you need, you tell me straight. No soft explanations. Same to you. And Owen works too. Whatever he can manage for his age. He needs to know how to work. She said it fiercely, like someone who had thought about this. He's not going to grow up thinking things just appear. Boone looked at the boy. Owen looked back. He can help with the morning eggs, Boone said, and learn to stack wood without taking a finger off. Owen's eyes lit up in a way Mabel hadn't seen in weeks. She almost said yes then. She caught herself. I need to think on it. Take your time, Boone said. He reached into his coat and came out with a folded paper. A map, she realized, hand-drawn, specific. He'd had it ready. He handed it to her without comment and started to turn back toward the store. Mr. Boone. He stopped. She didn't have the words for what she wanted to say. She wasn't sure she had the right to say anything at all. She stood there in the cold with her son's hand in hers and a map in her other hand, and finally she said, I don't know what you think you saw in there. He looked at her steadily. I saw a woman trying to do right by a debt that doesn't legally belong to her. She blinked. What do you mean it doesn't legally? I'm not a lawyer, he said, but I've had reason to look into Pruitt's methods before. Some of what he collects isn't as binding as he makes it sound. He paused. That's something worth understanding before you give him another cent. Then he tipped his head, went back inside, and left her standing on the board sidewalk with the wind picking up around her and the sky pressing down like it had somewhere to be. That night, in the single room she and Owen rented above the laundry, Mabel spread the map on the floor and studied it. The ranch was 9 miles out. The road would be manageable in fall, brutal in winter, impossible in a true blizzard. She thought about the winter everyone was talking about. The forecasters, the old-timers at the hardware store, the Arapaho man who sold dried herbs at the edge of town and who had looked at the sky 2 weeks ago and said, quietly, to no one in particular, bad one coming. She thought about Pruitt's face, the way he'd said vacate, like she was a squatter, like she had no right to take up the space she was already in. She thought about Owen's coat and the 2 inches of wrist. She made her decision in the dark before Owen had fully fallen asleep, listening to his breathing even out beside her. She had learned something early in her widowhood. The dangerous thing wasn't making the wrong decision. The dangerous thing was letting fear make the decision for you by making no decision at all. She rolled the map carefully and tucked it into her bag. They arrived at the Boone Ranch on a Thursday, in a wagon she'd borrowed from the woman she did laundry for, a Mrs. Aldrich who was decent enough and who looked at the map and said, Boone? That's a hard place in winter, in a tone that was neither encouragement nor warning, just fact. The ranch revealed itself slowly, first the fence line, then the outbuildings, then the main house, 2 stories, built for permanence rather than beauty. It had the look of something that had been added on to over the years. A room here, a porch there, not according to any plan but according to need. That was a thing Mabel could respect. Silas Boone was mending a fence section when they came down the track, and he looked up without surprise, like he'd heard them coming from a quarter-mile back. He walked to the wagon and helped Owen down first, which she noticed. You decided, he said. I said I had conditions. I remember them. I have one more. He waited. I won't be talked about, she said. Not by your hands, not by anyone on this property. I know how people talk. I know what they say. I don't expect you to control what's in their heads, but if I hear it said out loud, on your property, I'll address it myself. I just want you to know that in advance so you're not surprised. He considered her. Fair enough. And I'll need to know your full supply inventory before I can tell you what we're actually working with. Something happened at the corner of his mouth. It's inside. Then show me. The kitchen was larger than she'd expected. A big cast iron range, plenty of counter space, and a pantry that was in significantly worse shape than she'd hoped. She stood in the doorway of it and did the kind of rapid arithmetic she'd been doing since Thomas died. How many mouths, how many weeks, how much stretch she could get from a 50-pound sack of cornmeal if she was careful. She turned back to Boone, who was watching her from the kitchen doorway. How many hands do you have? 6, plus a part-time man who comes when the weather allows. What's your nearest supply town? Callaway Creek, 9 miles. And once the passes close? He said nothing for a moment. That's why I need someone who knows what they're doing with stores. She looked at the pantry again, the gaps on the shelves, the things that were there and the things that weren't. She thought about the skies she'd looked at every morning for the past 2 weeks and the smell that had been on the wind and what the old-timers were saying. You're going to need twice what you have, she said, at minimum. I know. That means trips to town before the snow comes. Multiple trips. You've been putting it off. He didn't deny it. Why? She asked, genuinely curious, not accusing. He took a moment before answering. My last cook told me I was being excessive, that I was worrying over nothing. He'd been at ranches through Montana winters before, he said, knew what was needed. A beat. He quit in September. Because the winters are too hard. That's what he said. Mabel looked at the pantry one more time, then at Silas Boone, and she thought, this man knows something is coming, and he's been unable to make himself believe it fully because nobody around him believed it either. She recognized that. She'd lived that. Knowing something and still somehow hoping you were wrong because being right was worse. I believe you now, she said. About the winters. He looked at her. We should start making a list, she said. His shoulders dropped about half an inch, which on a man like him was equivalent to a full exhale of relief. Kitchen tables this way. She followed him, and in the hall she passed a hand mirror on the wall, an old one, spotted at the edges. And she caught her own reflection in it and looked away before the old inventory could start. She knew what she looked like. She knew what people saw. She had decided a long time ago that she was going to move through the world anyway, and so she did. Owen had already found the dog, a big yellow animal who'd been sleeping under the porch steps and who now regarded the boy with the patient tolerance of an animal that had seen many children and survived them all. Owen was lying on his stomach on the ground, talking to the dog like it was a person. Owen, she called. His name is Biscuit, Owen called back. He told me. Dogs can't talk, she said. He implied it, Owen said. From the kitchen doorway, she heard something she hadn't expected. Silas Boone was laughing. Not loudly, but genuinely. The surprised kind that comes out before you can stop it. She turned and looked at him. He had the grace to look slightly caught out. He's a good kid, Boone said. I know, she said. And she went inside to start making the list, because there was work to do and winter was coming, and she had learned long ago that the only way through anything was through it, one practical step at a time. The first week was a negotiation between her plans and the reality of the ranch. She'd expected resistance from the hands, and she got it. Not open hostility at first, just the kind of careful testing that men do when they're not sure yet what they're dealing with. Longer than usual before coming to meals. Comments delivered sideways to each other, loud enough to carry. The main one was a man named Cord Yates. He was maybe 30, lean and weathered, the kind of man who'd been good-looking once and knew it, and hadn't adjusted to the fact that he was past it. He sat at the far end of the table the first night and looked at the food she set down with an expression that managed to be simultaneously unimpressed and offended. This all of it? He said. Portions the same for everyone, she said. Looks thin. It'll hold you through the night. She started to turn back to the stove. You seem like a woman who knows about portions, Yates said, and the man next to him snorted. Mabel stopped. She didn't turn around right away. She set the pan she was holding down on the stove carefully, and then she turned. Say that again, she said. Yates met her eyes. He hadn't expected her to turn around. I'm not asking you to say it louder, she said. I'm asking you to say it again, clearly, in front of the other men, so everyone knows exactly what kind of man you are. Say it again. Yates looked at the table. One of the other men, a quiet older hand named Denton, was very still. I didn't mean anything by it, Yates said. You meant everything by it, she said. I know the difference. She let that sit for a moment. I'm not going to pretend it didn't happen, but I'm also not going to make this into something that disrupts everyone's work and everyone's winter. So here's what we're going to do. You're going to eat what's in front of you, and tomorrow morning, you're going to be at the breakfast table at 5:30 like everyone else, and we're going to move forward. Can you manage that? Yates looked at his plate. Something had shifted in the room. The other men were watching, carefully. Yeah, Yates said finally. I can manage that. Good. She picked up the pan and went back to the stove. Denton, at the far end of the table, caught her eye for a moment. He gave her a single small nod, the kind that doesn't mean much and somehow means a lot. After dinner, when she was cleaning up and Owen was asleep and the hands had gone to the bunkhouse, Silas came into the kitchen. He poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter. I heard, he said. All right. I handled it, she said. I know you did. A beat. I just meant, Mr. Boone. She's kept her eyes on the pot she was scrubbing. I meant what I said. I handle my own business. I'm not asking you to fight my fights. I know you're not. He drank his coffee. I just wanted you to know that if it happens again, there'll be consequences. From me. Not because you need rescuing, because this is my ranch, and I won't have it on my ranch. She stopped scrubbing. She looked at him. That's fair, she said. It came out quieter than she intended. That's all I was saying, he said, and refilled his coffee and went back to his office. And that was the end of it. She stood at the sink for a moment longer than necessary, looking at the dark window and her own faint reflection in it. Outside, the wind had started picking up, moving through the pines the way it moved before snow. She could feel it in the gap under the back door, just a thread of cold air, a preview of what was coming. She had known what was coming since the first day she saw that pantry. She had known for longer than that, in some quieter part of herself that tracked the sky and the wind and the particular way the old men went silent when someone asked about the forecast. She had known, and she had come anyway, because Owen needed a warm bed, and she was running out of options, and this man, this quiet, watchful man who'd laughed at her son's joke about the dog, seemed like someone who would do what he said he would do. She dried her hands and went to check on Owen one more time before bed. He was tangled in his blankets the way he always slept, one arm flung out, the dog Biscuit somehow having made it up onto the foot of the mattress, despite being explicitly banned from the bedroom. She looked at both of them for a moment in the faint light from the hallway. Her plate sat in the dish rack, untouched. She had served everyone and then stood at the stove eating what was left standing up. Not enough, barely enough, but she'd told herself she wasn't hungry. She had been telling herself that for longer than she could clearly remember. It had started as a way to make the food stretch. It had become something else, something that lived in her body now, the habit of diminishment so thoroughly practiced that it felt like preference. She told herself she'd eat more tomorrow. She went to bed in the cold room at the end of the hall, listening to the wind work its way under the eaves, and she was asleep before she'd finished the thought. Outside, in the pines, something moved. A change in the air pressure, a dropping of temperature so subtle it might have been nothing at all. Somewhere up in the high passes, the first clouds of what would become the worst winter in 20 years were already building, slow and cold and indifferent, the way serious things move before the world realizes they're on their way. She was awake before the ranch stirred. That was the thing about Mabel. She didn't need an alarm, didn't need someone knocking on the door. Her body had calibrated itself to the hours of necessity over the past 2 years, waking her reliably at 4:30, sometimes 4, the way it wakes people who know there is work to do and no one else to do it if they sleep past it. She dressed in the cold dark, moving quietly so Owen wouldn't stir, and padded down the hall to the kitchen in her stocking feet carrying her boots. She lit the range first. Then she stood at the kitchen window for a moment, looking at the dark outside, and did what she always did at the start of each day on the ranch. She counted, mentally inventoried, how much flour was left, how many eggs, what could be stretched and what couldn't. It was the kind of arithmetic that had replaced other kinds of thinking, the bigger, softer thoughts she'd had before Thomas died, the ones about the future, about what she wanted. Those thoughts had become luxuries she couldn't afford, and she'd set them aside with the same practicality she applied to everything else. She started the bread first because bread took longest, and because a kitchen with bread baking did something to men that nothing else did. It made them cooperative, made them feel, however unconsciously, that someone was looking after things. She'd learned that from her mother, who had cooked for a mining camp outside Butte for 6 years, and who had said once, without sentiment, "Feed a man well, and he'll give you at least half the trouble he would have otherwise." By 5 o'clock, the kitchen smelled like bread and coffee, and by 5:30 the hands came in from the bunkhouse in various states of wakefulness, tracking mud and cold air with them. And Mabel put food on the table and poured coffee without ceremony and let the meal do what meals do. Cord Yates came in last. He sat at the same spot he'd sat the first night, at the far end of the table, and he looked at his plate and then at Mabel and then back at his plate. He said nothing. He ate. She registered this as adequate, not forgiveness, not friendship, just the ordinary functioning of a man who had been told where the line was and had, for now, decided not to cross it. Silas came to the kitchen after the hands had gone out. He ate standing at the counter the way he often did, scanning a list he'd written on a folded piece of paper. He was a man who carried lists. She'd noticed that. Methodical in the way that men become methodical when they've had to manage things alone for long enough. "I'm going into Callaway Creek today," he said. "Supplies. You made a list." She had. She slid the paper across the counter to him without looking up from the pan she was scrubbing. He looked at it for a long time. "This is more than I know," she said. "We'd be spending more than I know what it costs." She set the pan down and turned to face him. "And I know what it costs if you don't have it when the pass closes. Which one are you willing to live with?" He looked at her. There was something in his face that she was still learning to read. Not the blankness of indifference, but the quieter expression of someone who has opinions they don't always say out loud. "All right," he said. He folded the list and put it in his coat pocket. "The cornmeal especially," she said, "and the salt pork, and if there are dried beans, take as many sacks as the wagon will carry. Anything else?" "Lamp oil. You're lower than you think." He nodded once and left, and she listened to the sound of the wagon pulling out of the yard and went back to work. She had work enough for 3 people, and she did it with the systematic efficiency of someone who had learned to waste nothing. Not time, not flour, not movement. She baked through the morning, bread, a second batch, biscuits for the midday meal. She spent an hour inventorying the root cellar and came back up with a list of what was already there that she hadn't known about. Turnips, some winter squash, 3 crocks of preserves that had been sitting untouched for what looked like more than a year. She opened one carefully, tested it, found it still good. She wrote it all down in the small notebook she'd started keeping on the second day. Owen worked beside her through the morning. He was careful to be useful. She'd raised him to understand the value of usefulness. And by now he'd established a routine of his own. The chickens first, then stacking the wood silas or one of the hand split, then whatever she needed from him in the kitchen. He asked few questions while he was working, saving them up apparently for mealtimes, when he released them all at once like something he'd been holding in. "Why does Biscuit sleep under the porch during the day but inside at night?" he asked at lunch, seated across from her at the small kitchen table where she put his food. Not the main table, which was for the hands, but the kitchen table near the range, which was warmer. "Probably because it's colder at night," she said. "But he has all that fur." "Even things with fur get cold, Owen." "Do you think he misses someone?" She looked up from her own bowl. Owen was watching the dog, who was lying near the back door with his chin on his paws, eyes half open. Why would he miss someone? "He looks sad sometimes," Owen said, "like he's waiting." She considered this. Animals can look sad without being sad. They don't have the same... It's not the same as when a person looks sad. "How do you know?" "I don't," she admitted. "Not for certain." Owen nodded, satisfied with this for reasons she couldn't predict. He went back to his soup. She watched him eat, the healthy appetite of a boy who was sleeping properly and working physically for the first time in months, who had stopped looking over his shoulder at every unfamiliar sound. Something in her chest eased a little when she watched him eat. She finished about half of her own bowl and told herself that was enough. It wasn't enough. She knew it wasn't enough. But there was something in her, a habit so thoroughly grooved now that it operated below conscious decision, that kept measuring what she took for herself against what others might need, and finding her own portion to be the one that could be reduced. She'd started doing it when money first got tight, when stretching the food had been a mathematical necessity. Somewhere in the hard months after Thomas died, the math had become its own logic, separate from necessity, operating on a different kind of reasoning she didn't examine too closely. She put the bowls away and went back to the pantry. The second week brought 3 of the hands into cautious alliance with her, though none of them would have used that word. It happened the way trust happens in practical situations, not through conversation or warmth, but through demonstrated competence. They saw what she'd done with the supply list, saw the organized state of the pantry, watched her stretch the provisions further than their previous cook ever had, and drew their own conclusions. Denton, the older hand who'd nodded at her the first night, was the first to make any overture. He appeared at the kitchen door one afternoon while she was working, hat in hand, literally, actually holding it, which she noticed, and asked if she needed any of the heavy crocks moved from the cellar. "The ones near the back wall," she said, without turning. 3 of them. Heavy ones. He went without another word and came back with all 3 in 2 trips and set them where she pointed and left. No conversation about it. That was enough. That was in fact exactly right. She didn't need to be befriended. She needed to be treated like someone whose requests were worth fulfilling, and Denton had apparently made his decision about that independently and was acting accordingly. The hand named Ruiz, a compact younger man who said little and worked hard, started leaving firewood stacked by the kitchen door without being asked, which saved her from going to the main pile in the mornings when she needed the range lit. She didn't thank him for it, and he didn't seem to expect her to. The wood appeared, the range was lit. Work continued. Yates remained a problem, but a quiet one. He'd pulled back from open hostility into something more like watchful reluctance, eating his meals, doing his work, but with a particular quality of withholding, like a man reserving his judgment and making sure you knew he was reserving it. She didn't trust it. She'd known too many men like Cord Yates to mistake the pause for peace. She was restocking the storage shelf one evening when she heard him in the yard talking to one of the other hands, a newer man, barely older than a boy, named Fletcher. Their voices came in through the gap under the back door, not trying to be quiet, probably not thinking she could hear. "She runs this kitchen like a general," Fletcher was saying, and his voice held uncomplicated admiration. "She runs it like she's trying to prove something," Yates said. "So? She's doing the job." "She's doing 3 people's job and eating half of what Owen eats. I watched her at supper." A pause. "So what?" "Oh what?" Fletcher said, though with less certainty now. "Nothing." Yates's voice changed, not softer, but different, harder to read. "Just saying it's not normal is all." Their voices moved away, and she stood very still on the kitchen side of the door, jar of preserved beets in her hands, and something moved through her that she didn't want to look at directly. Not shame. Not quite. Something more like being seen in a way she hadn't given permission for, which was different from being seen kindly but felt worse in the moment. She put the beets on the shelf and finished the inventory and didn't think about it again, or at least told herself she didn't. It was Silas who first spoke to her about it directly, and he did it badly, which was probably why it landed the way it did instead of shutting her down entirely. They were in the kitchen, late, the way conversations happened in that kitchen, after the hands were in the bunkhouse and Owen was asleep and the ranch had settled into the sounds of wind and timber. Silas had developed a habit of appearing at that hour for his second cup of coffee. He didn't do it every night, and he never announced himself. He just came in when the light was still on and poured coffee and stood at the counter in the way of a man who is deciding whether he has something to say. Tonight, he had something to say. She could tell by the way he was standing. "You didn't eat dinner," he said. "I ate. I watched. You put food on your plate and then moved it around and then you started clearing the table before anyone else was done." She turned from the range. "With respect, you've done it every meal I've paid attention to," he said, "which is most of them." She said nothing, which was not the same as having nothing to say. "I'm not—" He stopped, recalibrated. She could see him working out how to say something he hadn't planned to say and was now committed to. "I'm not bringing this up because of— It's not about how you look or anything like that. It's because I watched my uncle slowly stop eating the winter after my aunt died, and he lasted 4 months. He set his coffee down. "The work you're doing on this ranch, the physical work, what you're carrying, Chol, you can't do it on what you're eating, practically speaking." She stood very still. "I'm saying it wrong," he said. "No," she said. "You said it clearly. Are you—" He looked uncomfortable, which on his face was almost invisible, but she'd learned enough to recognize the version of it he showed. "Is it because of—" "It's a habit," she said, and heard how flat that came out. "From when money was tightest, I got in the habit of making sure Owen had enough first, and then—" She stopped. "It became a habit." "All right," he said. I'm not doing it on purpose." "I know that," he said, and something in his voice said he might know it better than she was giving him credit for. "I'm just asking you to eat, for practical reasons, because we need you functional when this winter comes, and it's coming faster than anyone's admitting." She looked at him. "That's all I'm asking," he said. "Eat the same as everyone else." She wanted to say something sharp, about the fact that it wasn't his business, about the assumptions in the question, about the particular condescension of a man who'd eaten 3 full meals a day, his entire life telling her to eat. She could feel all of it right behind her teeth. But she looked at him, standing there at her counter with his coffee, clearly uncomfortable, clearly wishing he'd thought of a better way to say it, and she thought, he's not wrong. He's just not doing it well. I'll try, she said. And then, because she was honest, even when honesty was uncomfortable, I don't always notice I'm doing it. He nodded. Something in him that had been braced relaxed by a fraction. That's all I'm asking. He picked up his coffee and went back to his office, and she stood in the kitchen in the quiet and thought about all the things she'd become accustomed to not noticing. The first blizzard warning came on a Wednesday, 2 weeks and 4 days after she'd arrived at the ranch. It came in the form of Henry Marsh, the nearest neighboring rancher, who rode up the track in the mid-morning with his collar turned up and his face doing something complicated. "You hear from anyone in town?" he asked Silas in the yard. Mabel was at the kitchen window, and she could hear them clearly through the glass. "Not in the last 3 days," Silas said. "Old Pete Laramie's been watching the sky since Sunday," Marsh said. "Says he's never seen the cloud formation look like this in October. Says it's going to hit by Friday at the latest." Pete Laramie's been wrong before. "He's been wrong about rain," Marsh said. "He's never been wrong about snow." A pause. "How are your stores?" "Better than they were." Silas glanced toward the kitchen window, and Mabel stepped back, then felt faintly ridiculous for doing it. "We've been working at it." "I came to tell you," Marsh said, and there was something in his voice now that she hadn't expected, something that made her be still. "I came to tell you because you didn't have anyone telling you last year when the February storm came and you lost what you lost." Silence. "I know," Silas said. His voice had changed. "I'm not rubbing at it. I'm just saying, I should have ridden over then, and I didn't, and you lost 14 head. That's on me as a neighbor." "That's not—" "Some of it is," Marsh said, and there was a finality in it that closed the subject. "Friday at the latest. Tell your hands." He rode out, and Mabel went back to the range and pretended she hadn't heard, and Silas came in 5 minutes later and stood in the kitchen doorway. "You heard?" he said. "Some of it." "How are we, actually?" She thought about it carefully before answering. "Enough for 6 weeks if we're careful. Maybe 8 if we're strict. The work we've done this month has put us in a different position than you were in." She paused. "But the cattle are the variable," he said. "I know. If the snow comes fast and they can't reach the lower pasture, I know." He said it quietly, without frustration at her, just the quiet of a man who has run the numbers himself and doesn't love the answer. "I'm going to move them tomorrow, and we need to bring in everything from the upper storage shed." "I'll start the extra preserving today," she said. "Whatever produce is left in the cellar that won't last. I can put it up if you can give me Ruiz for 2 hours to help with the heavy lifting." "Done." He turned to go, then stopped. "Mabel." She turned. He stopped and started again, which was unusual for him. "You prepared for this. What you did with the stores this month. That wasn't— I want you to know I understand what that cost in terms of work." She held his gaze for a moment. "It's my job," she said. "It's above your job." "Then it's my job as I understand it," she said, and turned back to the range. She heard him exhale behind her, not in frustration, she thought, but in something that was harder to name. The rest of that day moved fast. She worked through the afternoon and into the evening with Ruiz quietly handing her jars and carrying crocks, and following her directions without comment, and by the time Owen was asleep, she'd added 2 full shelves of preserved vegetables to the pantry and felt the particular exhaustion of having worked longer than her body wanted to and pushed past it anyway. She sat at the kitchen table for a moment when it was quiet, just sat, which she rarely let herself do. Her hands ached. The joints in her knees ached. She had been on her feet for 16 hours, and the only real meal she'd eaten was the midday soup, which she had finished. She'd actually finished it, all of it, and it had felt strange, the way it always felt strange when she let herself eat properly. A combination of relief and something adjacent to guilt that she knew was irrational and couldn't seem to stop anyway. She was still sitting there, head bowed over her folded hands, when she heard the sound she'd been bracing for all week. Wind. Real wind, not the ordinary evening wind, but the deeper register of something coming down from the mountains with intention, the kind of sound that doesn't negotiate with what's in its path. She heard it work through the pines behind the barn, a low, sustained roar, rising and falling, but never disappearing. Owen appeared in the kitchen doorway in his nightshirt, hair sideways, holding Biscuit by the collar, because the dog had apparently woken him by trying to get under the bed. "Is that the blizzard?" he asked. "Not yet," she said. That's the wind before the blizzard. He stood there, small and serious, listening. Are we going to be okay? She looked at him. She thought about the pantry. She thought about the preserved jars on the shelves, the cornmeal and salt pork Silas had hauled from Callaway Creek, the extra firewood stacked in the woodshed, the lamp oil, the root vegetables, the inventory in her small notebook with its careful columns of numbers. She thought about every early morning and every late night and every decision she'd made in the past 3 weeks about what to keep and what to stretch and where to put what. Yes, she said. She said it like she knew it. We're going to be okay. He came and sat beside her at the kitchen table, and the dog came and put his head on Owen's knee, and the three of them sat there in the warm kitchen while the wind built outside. And Mabel watched her son listen to the storm coming and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not safety, not exactly. Something more precise than that. The feeling of having prepared, of having done the work, of being, for this moment at least, ahead of what was coming rather than running from it. Outside, the first fat snowflakes began to strike the kitchen window. Slowly at first, scattered, then faster, finding their rhythm. The fire in the range crackled. The lamp on the table threw its small circle of warmth. And in the yard, somewhere out past the barn, the cattle were already restless, pressing together in the dark, reading the air with the ancient accuracy of animals that understand weather in their bones, and know, without being told, that the real thing is almost here. The snow came in the night and it didn't stop. By morning, the yard was unrecognizable, so the fence posts had shortened by half, the woodshed had become a white shape with no edges, and the trail that connected the main house to the barn had disappeared entirely under a drift that reached Silas's chest when he walked out to check it at first light. He came back inside, stamping snow from his boots, face red with cold, and Mabel already had coffee on the table. How bad? She asked. Bad. He pulled off his gloves. The lower pasture gate is buried. I need to get to the cattle. Ruiz and Denton? Already in the barn. I went around the back way. He sat, drank, stood again in the way of a man who can't convince himself to stay still when there's work being not done. Fletcher got turned around between the bunkhouse and the barn last night. Found him this morning leaning against the wrong wall entirely. Is he hurt? Cold. Embarrassed. Fine. He pulled his gloves back on. I need you to keep the range going regardless of what the firewood situation looks like. Heat in this house is not negotiable. I know, she said. I mean it. I know you'll try to conserve Silas. She looked at him steadily. I know. He left, and she turned back to the range, and the day began in earnest. What she had understood about the storm that first morning, and what most of the ranch hands had not yet understood, was that the danger wasn't the snow itself. Snow could be moved, waited out, lived with. The danger was the cold that came in behind it, a temperature drop so severe that it changed the arithmetic of every calculation she'd made about their supplies. Cold at those levels meant the body burned more just to maintain itself. It meant more food required, not less. It meant wood consumption she hadn't quite planned for. She revised her numbers at the kitchen table while the biscuits baked, working in the small notebook, her handwriting getting smaller and more compressed as she worked through the columns. She had enough. She believed she had enough. But the margin was thinner than she'd have liked, and she spent the first 3 days of the storm quietly tightening things in ways she hoped no one would notice. The bread went a little further. The portions at dinner looked the same, but were arranged differently on the plates. She added more dried beans to the stew, more broth, less salt pork. A man eating a full bowl of something hot in a cold room doesn't usually calculate whether he's getting the same mass he got yesterday, and none of them did. What she was giving Owen, she made sure of. His portions she didn't touch. His morning porridge was full and properly sweetened, and she watched him eat every morning with the particular attention of a mother who has known hunger and has decided, with a ferocity that is entirely quiet and entirely absolute, that her child will not know it if she has anything to say about it. What she gave herself, she didn't examine too closely. She told herself it was necessity. It felt like necessity. The fact that she'd been doing some version of it for longer than the storm had been blowing, that thought she kept moving past, the way you move past a loose floorboard you know is there, and have learned to step around. On the 4th day, the storm eased enough for the hands to work the livestock without fighting just to stay upright, and Mabel used the relative quiet to take full inventory of the root cellar. She went down with the lamp and the notebook and she counted everything twice. And when she came back up, Silas was in the kitchen and he looked at her face. "Tell me," he said. "We're all right on the dry goods and preserved jars," she said. "The root vegetables are the question." She laid the notebook on the table. "We lost about a third of the turnips. Something got to them before we got here. Rot I didn't catch in time. The squash is holding." He looked at the numbers. He was quiet for a moment. "The cattle?" She looked up. "Not your department," he said. "I know, I'm just—" He set the notebook down. "Lost 3 head in the first night. The ones that were already weak from the drive down from summer pasture." She said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say. "If this keeps going another 3 weeks," he said, "we'll be looking at feeding from the hay reserves by the 2nd week, which I planned for, but not at this temperature." He looked at the window, which was so frosted over, it had become opaque. "I didn't plan for this temperature." "Nobody planned for this temperature," she said. "Nobody's planned for this temperature in 20 years. They looked at each other across the kitchen table. "What do you need?" he asked. "More lamp oil would help, and if any of the hands aren't critical to livestock duty, I could use someone to help me move the remaining supply crates to the main house. If the woodshed is accessible from the— I'll have Ruiz do it this afternoon." "Good." She picked up the notebook. "And Silas?" He'd started to turn. He stopped. "The hands need to be eating the full portion," she said. "I know it's tempting to think about rationing across the board, but they're working outside in this cold for hours. They need the fuel or their judgment starts going and then we have accidents." He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. "I've been thinking the same thing," he said. "Good, then we agree." He left and she stood at the range and stared at the coffee pot and allowed herself, for exactly 2 minutes, to feel the exhaustion she'd been carrying without acknowledging. Then she put it back wherever she kept it and started on the noon meal. The rumors from Callaway Creek reached the ranch on the 6th day of the blizzard, carried by Henry Marsh, who appeared at the door looking like something that had survived a war. Mabel let him in, brought him to the range to warm, poured coffee with more generosity than she was allowing for anything else, and listened to what he said. He said it badly, in the halting way of someone delivering news they'd rather not be delivering, between long pauses and sips of coffee that fogged his glasses and left him blinking. The short version was this: 3 families in Callaway Creek itself were in serious trouble. The Pruitt banking concern, Gerald Pruitt's outfit, had called in short-term notes at the start of October, before the storm, extracting whatever cash reserves several farming families had managed to hold. 2 of those families had come through the summer lean. They were now into the first week of a brutal winter with depleted food stores and no money to replenish them, and the road to the supply store was impassable. "Mrs. Aldrich and her family," Marsh said, "and the Ferguson place, and old Daniel Spears who lives alone and hasn't been seen in 4 days. He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking if— Can you get back to town?" Silas asked. "If I go now and the wind doesn't pick back up." Silas looked at Mabel. She had already done the math. She'd done it while Marsh was still talking, the way the calculation lived in her now, constantly running in the background like a fire that never goes out. She thought about the shelves. She thought about the numbers in the notebook. She thought about what she'd said to Silas about not rationing the hands. "Yes," she said, "but it has to be specific. I need to know exactly how many people we're talking about and roughly what they have." Marsh told her, and she went to the pantry and stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at the shelves she'd built up over the past month. She thought about the laundress in town who had lent her a wagon and said that's a hard place in winter without any warmth in it, but with the flatness of simple truth. She thought about Mrs. Aldrich's kitchen, which she'd been in 3 times while doing laundry, and the woman's 2 young grandchildren who were being raised there because their mother had died of fever. She pulled down 12 jars from the shelf. Then she added 4 more. Then she went to the sacks and measured out what she could. "This isn't nothing," she said, carrying things to the table. "Tell Mrs. Aldrich the preserved squash will go twice as far if she adds a handful of dried corn. And the Spears man, can someone check on him today before you ride back?" "I'll go myself," Marsh said. Silas helped Marsh load the horse, working out in the cold, and Mabel watched from the window. She was doing the revised arithmetic in her head. The new number, what they were left with, what that meant for the weeks ahead. The margin was thinner now, not dangerous. Not yet, but thinner. When Silas came back in, he looked at her. That thinned our reserves, he said. It wasn't accusation, it was just fact, offered in the neutral tone of a man who believed in naming things clearly. Yes, she said. You didn't ask me. No, she said. I didn't. She met his eyes. Do you want me to have? A pause. Something in him settled. No, he said. I just want you to tell me when it happens. It just happened, she said. I'm telling you now. He came close to something that was almost a smile. Almost. He went to pour the last of the coffee, found the pot empty, and looked at her. Is there more? There's always more coffee, she said, and took the pot from him, and that was the end of it. It was Cord Yates who started the talking, though Mabel didn't hear it directly. She heard it the way she heard most things about herself on this ranch, through the gap under the back door, or through the kitchen window, or in the altered way people carried themselves when they'd been saying something they didn't want her to know about. The version that reached her, through Owen, of all people, who had heard it while stacking wood near the bunkhouse, was this. Yates had been telling the newer hands that Mabel was the reason their supplies had been thinned, that she'd made the decision to give away ranch provisions without proper authority, that a woman who could stand to miss a few meals herself had no business deciding how much food other people got. Owen delivered this information in the kitchen while she was straining broth, standing close to her side, speaking in the carefully even tone of a child who has learned to present difficult news calmly and doesn't want her to see how it landed on him first. She strained the broth. She didn't stop what she was doing. Did he say that to you? She asked. Not to me, I just heard it. Owen paused. Fletcher looked uncomfortable. He didn't say anything, but he looked uncomfortable. That's something, she said. Are you angry? She thought about it honestly. Yes, she said, but not as angry as I would have been a month ago. Why not? She strained the last of the broth before answering. Because a month ago I would have worried he was right. Owen was quiet for a moment. He's not right. I know that, she said. I know it now. She set the strainer down and looked at her son, this small, careful boy who'd been carrying things too heavy for him for 2 years without ever being asked to, without complaint, out of love for her. Don't let people like that take up too much room in your head, Owen. They're louder than they are large. He considered this. Is that something Grandma used to say? No, she said. That's something I just made up. He thought about it. It's pretty good, he said, with the evaluative confidence of a child who has decided he's a fair judge of such things, and went back to stacking wood. She let it sit through the afternoon, let the anger do what anger does when you don't act on it immediately. Shrink a little, become something more useful. By dinner, she had decided what to do, which was less than Yates expected and more than he was comfortable with. She served dinner as she always served it. When the plates were down and the men were eating, she remained at the head of the table instead of returning to the stove, which was unusual, and the unusual thing made them all look up. I made a decision this week to send supplies to 3 families in Callaway Creek, she said. Her voice was even, not loud, not performing. Families who were in trouble because of the storm. I made that decision without consulting Mr. Boone first, and I told him about it afterward, and he accepted it. She looked at no one in particular, which meant she was somehow looking at everyone. If any of you have concerns about how this kitchen is managed, those concerns come to me directly. Not to the newer men, not in the yard. She paused. That's all. She went back to the stove. No one said anything. Yates was looking at his plate with an expression she couldn't see clearly from where she stood. Denton was eating with the studied focus of a man who has decided the best thing he can do is exactly that. Ruiz had stopped cutting his bread and hadn't started again. Silas, at the end of the table, was looking at her with an expression she was only beginning to know how to read. She didn't look back. She had said what needed saying, and now there was food to manage and a range to tend and a winter that was not, by any reasonable estimate, more than halfway done. 3 days after Marcia's visit, the cold broke enough that Silas could get to the upper pasture and assess the cattle properly for the first time since the storm's worst days. Mabel stayed at the house, and the news he brought back when he returned in the late afternoon was the kind that sits in a room without being invited. He lost 7 more. 3 of them he'd found frozen in the upper pasture, too far from the shelter of the lower ground. 4 more had died in a cluster near the broken section of the eastern fence, a section he hadn't been able to get to when the storm first hit. He came in and sat down at the kitchen table and said nothing for a long time. She put food in front of him and he looked at it without eating. 7, he said eventually. I heard you tell Denton. That's 11 total. He looked at his hands. I started this winter with 212 head. She sat down across from him, which she didn't always do when he was at the table. You still have 201. I know the number. The losses are terrible, she said. I'm not going to dress that up. But you have 201 cattle that are alive because the hands worked the lower pasture, because you moved them early, because you had feed stored. I should have fixed the eastern fence before the snow. Probably, she said. He looked at her. Most people she knew would not have said probably. Most people would have said you couldn't have known, or there's no way you could have gotten to everything. She'd found that the thing people needed most when they were blaming themselves was not to be told they were wrong to, but to have someone sit with them in the accurate version of events rather than the softened one. The eastern fence was on the list, he said. I had it on the list from September. I kept prioritizing other things. Yes. 7 cattle. Yes. She held his gaze. And you'll fix the fence in spring, and you'll move them earlier next year. And you know something now about this ranch in a bad winter that you didn't know going in. She paused. That knowledge cost 11 animals. It'll save you more than that over the rest of your years here if you use it right. He looked at her for a long moment. He looked like a man who was deciding whether the thing he was feeling was resentment or something else. You don't soften things, he said. No. I've noticed that. Is it a problem? No, he said. He picked up his fork. No, it's not a problem. He ate, slowly at first, then with the more ordinary appetite of a man who has been outside in serious cold for hours. She watched him eat with the same private attention she watched everyone eat, the constant assessment that had become second nature. Is he getting enough? Is he holding up? What does he need that he's not asking for? She got up and refilled his coffee without being asked. Mabel, he said. She stopped. Something in the way he said it was different from the ordinary way he said her name, which was already not a careless thing. He used people's names when he wanted them to pay attention, she'd noticed, and she always paid attention when he did it. But there was something added this time. Sit down, he said. I was just going to... I know. Sit down. She sat. He looked at her directly, in the unswerving way he had. When did you last eat a meal and stay at the table for it? She started to speak, and he shook his head. Not a partial answer, a real one. She thought about it, which was itself an answer. I don't always. I eat in stages, she said, while I'm working. What did you eat today? I had coffee this morning. What else? She thought about it honestly. Some bread, the end of a loaf, and I had some of the broth when I was straining it. Something crossed his face that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief and was uncomfortable to look at. That's not a day's eating, he said. That's not close to a day's eating. I know, she said, and this time she said it without the usual following explanation. The habit, the math, the necessity. She said it plainly because she was tired, because the storm had been going on for a long time, and because in the flat honesty of that kitchen with the lamp burning low, she didn't have the energy to construct the usual architecture around it. I know. He was quiet for a long moment. He was looking at her the way he looked at problems he was trying to solve, with complete attention, without rushing to the solution, assessing. Then eat now, he said. He pushed his own plate toward the center of the table. Get a plate and eat now. She didn't argue. She got a plate. She sat back down. She ate at the kitchen table with Silas Boone across from her, and neither of them said anything for a while, and the wind worked through the eaves overhead in the particular key of a Montana winter that has decided it is in no hurry to leave. It was not a comfortable silence exactly, but it was the kind of silence that two people can share without needing to fill it, and that was its own thing. She ate more than she meant to. She noticed it and kept eating anyway. The debt collector arrived on a Tuesday, in the brief clearing between the second storm and what the sky was already promising would be a third. He came in a rented wagon with 2 armed men riding alongside, and he didn't look like the weather had been particularly hard on him which told her he'd been waiting somewhere close until the road was passable enough to make his approach. His name, as he gave it at the door, was Victor Crail. He had a way of holding himself that suggested he'd developed the posture specifically to intimidate people who were shorter than him, which was most people. He asked for Mabel Harper by name. She heard it from the kitchen, heard the knock, heard Silas's voice at the door, heard her name, and felt the cold move through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. She came to the door herself. She stood behind Silas, and she looked at Victor Crail and the two men with him and the papers in his hand, and she understood exactly what this was before he opened his mouth to explain it. "Mrs. Harper," he said, "Victor Crail, representing the First Territorial Bank of Callaway Creek and associated lending interests. I have a writ here, executed under the authority of the territory, for collection of an outstanding debt attached to the late Thomas Harper's estate, in the amount of $212, compounded with interest and collection fees to $304 at this date." He held out the papers. "I'd ask you to look these over." She didn't take the papers. She looked at him. "My husband surrendered the homestead," she said. "The debt attached to the homestead went with it. That's how the law works." "The debt attached to the homestead was discharged," Crail said, with the particular smoothness of someone who has made this speech before and knows exactly where it goes. "However, there are associated notes, personal notes, co-signed by your husband prior to the homestead transaction, that were not discharged in that surrender. Those notes are the subject of this writ." "I don't know about any personal notes," she said. "I have them here, Mrs. Harper. Your husband's signature is on them." "Then I'd like a lawyer to look at them." Crail's expression did the thing she'd seen Pruitt's expression do in the general store. That particular compound of condescension and calculation, the look of a man who has correctly identified that the person in front of him doesn't have the resources to fight him, and is counting on that being the end of it. "Of course," he said. "In the meantime, you understand that the writ creates a lien on any assets currently in your possession, including wages, any arrangement or partnership." He looked past her into the house, and then at Silas, "or any property you might be residing in." The silence that followed was significant. Silas had been standing very still through this entire exchange, which she had come to understand was not the stillness of a man who was absent from the situation, but the stillness of one who was paying very close attention to it. "Mr. Crail," Silas said. "Mr. Boone." "You're welcome to your legal process," Silas said. "In the meantime, you and your men are standing in the open in a temperature that's going to kill someone if they're out in it past dark. I won't turn men away from a ranch in this weather. You can have the bunkhouse tonight." He paused. "In the morning, you can continue your business." Crail looked at him with an expression that was recalibrating. "That's decent of you," he said. "It's practical," Silas said. "Come in." He turned from the door without looking at Mabel, and she understood that he was leaving the moment to her, leaving her to decide whether to follow or not, and she stood at the door for another second looking at Victor Crail and his papers and the two armed men who looked bored by the whole proceedings, in the way that men are bored when they've seen this particular scene many times in many doorways. She stepped back and held the door, and they came in, and she went to the kitchen and stood at the range with her back to the room. Her hands were not steady. She made them steady. She kept them on the familiar surface of the range, on the warmth of it, and she breathed. She had known something like this was coming. She had known it since the general store, since the look on Pruitt's face when Silas had intervened, since the moment she'd looked at those papers Thomas had left, and understood that there were things in there she didn't fully understand yet. She'd been telling herself she would deal with it when she had more time, more money, more options. She had been telling herself that while she cooked and preserved and rationed through the worst winter in 20 years, and now it was here, and she was standing in Silas Boone's kitchen with $304 of claimed debt hanging over her head, and the understanding, slow and cold and settling, that if this held, if it was legitimate, then everything she'd built over the past month, every preserved jar, every stretched portion, every day of work, might ultimately be taken to satisfy a claim she wasn't sure she owed. And beneath that, quieter and harder to look at, the thought that Silas's property, his ranch, his winter's work, might be at risk because of her. Because she was here. Because she had come. She thought about Owen, asleep down the hall in the warm room. She thought about the pantry, which she had built, which had kept 11 people alive through a storm that had already killed livestock across the territory. She set the coffee pot on the range with a small, careful click, and she stood up straight, and she decided that she was not going anywhere. Not yet. Not without a fight of the kind she actually knew how to run. Outside, the sky was going the color of iron again, and somewhere up in the high passes, the next storm was already building its head of steam, indifferent to the particular human drama unfolding 9 miles outside of Callaway Creek, Montana territory, in a kitchen that smelled like bread and coffee and the particular dry warmth of a range that had not gone cold in 3 weeks. She turned around and started making dinner for 14 people, because that was what needed doing, and she had learned a long time ago that the work didn't stop because you were frightened, and that sometimes the only thing you could do with fear was put it in your hands and make it useful. Victor Crail ate well that night, which Mabel found she could not entirely prevent herself from noticing. He sat at the main table with his 2 men and ate what she put in front of him, the same as everyone else, though he looked at the portions with the eyes of a man accustomed to more, and he made small, satisfied sounds that she heard from the kitchen and that made something in her jaw tighten. He complimented the bread to no one in particular. He asked for more coffee, which she provided because the alternative was making a point that would cost more than it was worth. Silas ate at the end of the table and said almost nothing through the meal. He had that quality of silence that isn't absence. He was tracking everything she could over the past weeks. He watched Crail. He watched his own men. He watched Mabel when he thought she wasn't looking, though she usually was. The 2 armed men, she'd heard one called Briggs, the other hadn't been introduced, ate with the uncomplicated appetite of men who are paid to be present rather than to think, and they were done and pushing back their chairs before anyone else had finished. Owen ate in the kitchen, which she'd arranged before dinner without explanation. He was 8 and perceptive, and she didn't want him at that table tonight. He hadn't argued, which meant he understood more than she'd said, which was its own kind of ache. After the meal, Crail lingered. He stood near the fireplace in the main room with his coffee, radiating the ease of a man who believed his presence was welcome. And when Silas didn't move to his office, Crail seemed to understand that the evening had a shape he hadn't set. "Reasonable man, Mr. Boone," he said. "I appreciate that. Some of these frontier situations turn disagreeable over something that's really just a matter of paperwork." "Paperwork," Silas said. "Legal instruments, nothing personal." He turned his cup in his hands. "The debt is valid. I have the documentation. All Mrs. Harper needs to do is acknowledge it formally, and we can discuss an arrangement." "An arrangement," Silas said. "Extended payment terms. Something workable." Crail looked towards the kitchen, where Mabel was washing dishes, and where the sound of it covered, or was meant to cover, whatever expression was on her face. "I'm not an unreasonable man." "You came with armed men," Silas said. "Standard practice in territory collection." "Standard practice," Silas repeated, in the tone of someone cataloging a thing rather than accepting it. Crail smiled and drank his coffee and looked at the fire, and something about the comfort of him in that room. In Silas's house, near Silas's fire, with papers in his bag that threatened to undo 3 months of her work and her son's security, made Mabel scrub the pot in her hands harder than was necessary and then make herself slow down. She heard Silas's voice from the main room, quieter now, and Crail's answering murmur, and she stopped trying to parse it and focused on finishing the kitchen so she could check on Owen. He was in his room, awake, sitting on the bed with Biscuit pressed against his side. He looked up when she came in. "Who is that man?" he asked. She sat on the edge of the bed. Biscuit shifted and put his chin on her knee. "He's from a bank," she said. "He says your father owed money." Owen was quiet for a moment. "Did he?" "I don't know yet." She said it honestly because Owen had a reliable instinct for when he was being managed, and she'd promised herself early that she wouldn't do to him what had been done to her. Wouldn't let him be surrounded by a world that was falling apart while everyone told him it was fine. "That's what I have to find out." "What happens if he did?" She looked at her son. 8 years old, sitting straight on his bed in a room that had been warm for 3 months because of work she'd done, on a ranch that belonged to someone else, in a situation she hadn't planned for. She thought about how to answer honestly without giving him the weight of the full answer. "Then we'll handle it," she said. "But what if we can't?" "Owen." She put her hand on his. "I have not yet run out of things to try." He looked at her hand on his. Something in his face did what children's faces do when they're deciding whether to believe an adult. That brief, complicated negotiation between hope and realism. "Okay," he said. Get some sleep, she said. She went back down the hall and stood for a moment outside the main room, listening. Creel's voice, then silence, then Silas saying something she couldn't hear. She went to the kitchen instead of in, because there was still work she could do, and she did it. And eventually the main room went quiet and the ranch settled, and she stood at the kitchen window in the dark for a long time before she went to bed. She didn't sleep well. She didn't tell anyone that. Creel left in the morning with the writ and his 2 men and a copy of the documents he'd presented, which Silas had read carefully at the kitchen table, while Mabel poured coffee and did not hover, but stayed close enough to see his face change as he read. She watched his eyes move down the page. She watched the small frown deepen. She watched him flip to the second page and then back to the first. These signatures, he said. Thomas's signature, yes, she said. I recognized it. The date on this first note. He looked up. This is dated 3 months before the homestead surrender. I know. Did you know about it when Thomas signed it? She sat down across from him. No. Did Thomas tell you anything about it? About the loan? She thought back to that period, the months before the surrender, which had been bad months, months full of the particular quiet that settles over a house when the person in it is losing a fight they haven't yet admitted they're losing. Thomas hadn't told her about a lot of things toward the end. She hadn't known whether it was pride or protection, and she'd never gotten the chance to ask him. He didn't tell me, she said. But that doesn't mean it didn't happen. Silas looked at the papers again. The interest calculations are wrong. She looked up. The rate they've applied here, it's above the territorial limit for personal notes. I'm not a lawyer, but I know what the limit is because I took out a note from that same bank 3 years ago and argued with them about the rate. He set the papers down. If the rate is illegal, the debt as calculated isn't valid. The original principal might be, but not this number. She stared at him. You can prove that? I can if I can get to the right records. He tapped the papers. These were issued by Pruitt's bank. Pruitt's operation has been creative with their documentation before. I told you that, in Callaway Creek. You said you'd had reason to look into his methods, she said. You never told me how much you knew. He was quiet for a moment, long enough that she knew there was something there. Tell me, she said. He looked at the window. The sky outside was the particular gray of a day that hadn't decided yet what it was going to do. My wife, he said. She died 4 years ago. Before she died, when she was sick, I had to make decisions about money that I wouldn't have made otherwise. I borrowed from Pruitt's bank. The terms weren't what I agreed to. By the time I understood that, I was in a hole it took me 2 years to get out of. She said nothing. I got out, he said. Other people didn't. Some of those people... He stopped. There's a man in Callaway Creek named Aldous Webb. He's a territorial land records keeper. He's the one who helped me understand what Pruitt had done with my note. He's old and he doesn't like to get involved in things, but he knows where every document in that territory is filed, and he knows which ones don't match. He folded the papers and stood. I think I need to visit Aldous Webb. The road is passable today, he said. Barely, but today it is. He went to the window and looked out, assessing. I can make Callaway Creek by noon if I leave now. She looked at him. She thought about the cattle and the fence and the 1,000 things that needed managing on this ranch every day, the things that couldn't wait. Denton can manage the livestock, he said, reading her face. Ruiz knows the routine. He pulled on his coat. I should have done this a month ago. When Creel first showed up, I should have... He stopped. I was waiting to see if it was real. It's real, she said. I know that now. He buttoned the coat. I should have... Silas? She waited until he looked at her. Go. Right now is when matters, not a month ago. He held her gaze for a moment, then nodded and went to get his horse. She stood in the kitchen after he was gone and listened to the ranch. The sounds it made when it was running, the creak of the barn, the low complaint of the wind, the distant voices of the hands at morning work. She had learned the sounds of this place the way she'd learned all places she'd lived long enough in, not consciously but through the accumulation of mornings and evenings until the sounds became a baseline she could read variations against. She went back to work, because that was what there was. It was Owen who broke it open, and he did it that evening, and he did it in the way that children do devastating things, without fully understanding the devastation, out of a love so complete it overrides every other calculation. Silas hadn't returned yet. The road back from Callaway Creek had apparently been harder than the road in. A hand from the Marsh Ranch had come by in the early afternoon with word that the pass road had drifted again in the afternoon wind, and no one was getting through until morning. Mabel had received this information with the kind of controlled stillness she'd practiced so thoroughly it no longer required any effort. She fed the hands their dinner. She fed Owen. She sat with him at the kitchen table while he ate, which she did most nights now, sat across from him with something in front of her, eating, or at least appearing to, more consistently than she'd managed before Silas had said what he'd said. Tonight she was tired in a way that went past the body, and she was only halfway present at the table, the rest of her mind working through the legal question of the debt, through what Silas might find in Callaway Creek, through what it would mean if he found nothing useful. She was staring at the table when Owen said, "Mom." Can I tell you something?" "Always." He set his spoon down with care, which got her attention. He set things down carefully when he was preparing himself for something. She looked at him. "I've been keeping a promise I'm not sure I should have made," he said. She waited. He looked at his hands. I was the most careful 8-year-old she had ever encountered, and she had encountered many, and she recognized the expression on his face. It was the expression of someone who has been carrying something until carrying it has become more expensive than setting it down. "When Dad was sick," he said, "at the end, he made me promise not to tell you some things." Something went very still in her. "He made me promise because he said you had enough to worry about." Owen looked up at her. "But I think—" He stopped. Reconsidered. "I think he was wrong. I think you needed to know, and he was scared to tell you himself, and so he asked me to carry it instead. And I was 8, I'm 8 now, but I was 7 then, and—" "Owen," she said softly, "tell me." He pulled in a breath. He knew about the note, the bank note that man Crail brought. He knew about it, and he was ashamed because he'd been told it was a short-term thing, and then the terms changed and he couldn't pay it, and he didn't want you to know he'd gone to the bank without telling you because you'd told him the homestead wasn't viable, and he'd done it anyway to try to save it, and it didn't work. He said all of this in a single rush of breath, the way children confess things they've been holding too long. "He made me promise not to tell you because he said it would hurt you, but I think not telling you hurts you too." She couldn't speak for a moment. "There's more," Owen said, and his voice was quieter now, following the more difficult thing. She waited. "He told me—" He stopped. Then, "He said that you were the strongest person he knew, that you had always been the strongest person he knew, and that he was sorry he'd spent so much of their time together, making you feel like you were less than that, because people said things, and he didn't. He said he should have said more." Owen looked at her directly, with the full weight of his 8-year-old seriousness. "He said he was sorry he let people make you feel small when you were the biggest person in any room you were ever in. He made me memorize that. He said, 'Tell her that. Tell her I'm sorry for the times I didn't say it.'" The kitchen was very quiet. She realized her hands were flat on the table. She didn't remember putting them there. "I've been trying to find the right time," Owen said, "but I don't think there is a right time. I think I've just been scared you'd be sad." She looked at her son across the kitchen table, this child who had been carrying his dying father's words for a year and a half, who had held them with the seriousness of a boy who understood that promises matter, and who had finally, tonight, understood that some promises cost more than they're worth. "I'm not sad," she said. Her voice came out rougher than she expected. "You look sad." "I look—" She pressed her fingers against her mouth for a moment. "That's not sad, exactly. That's something else." He watched her carefully. "Come here," she said. He came around the table and she put her arms around him, and he let her, which he was beginning to be old enough to sometimes resist, and she held him for a moment in the quiet kitchen. "You did right," she said into the top of his head, "telling me. You did absolutely right." "Even though I promised him?" "Even though." She loosened her hold and looked at him. "Some promises are too heavy for one person to hold alone. Your father should have known better than to put that on you." "He was dying," Owen said in the straightforward way children sometimes state unbearable things. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm not angry at him. But I'm angry on your behalf a little. You should have been able to just be his son, not his—" She stopped. Not his message carrier. Owen considered this. Then he said, "Do you think Mr. Boone will find something useful?" She blinked at the transition, then understood that for him, the urgency of it was all running together. The confession, the debt, the ranch. Silas riding to Callaway Creek in the cold. "I think he'll try," she said. "Is trying enough?" "Sometimes it has to be," she said. And then, because she'd promised herself she wouldn't manage him, "I don't know yet, Owen. We'll know more when he gets back." He nodded. He went back around the table and picked up his spoon and finished his dinner with the composure of a child who has done something difficult and survived it, which had apparently restored his appetite. She watched him eat, and she thought about Thomas in his last months, and she thought about a man too proud and too frightened to tell his wife the truth, choosing instead to lay it on their 7-year-old like a stone. She had loved Thomas Harper. That was still true and had its own complicated shape. But she could love a person and also see them clearly, and what she saw clearly now was a man who had, in the end, made his fear into her problem and their son's problem, and had called it protection. She was still sitting with that when she heard hoofbeats in the yard. Silas came in frozen and moving fast, which was unusual enough that Denton appeared at the back door behind him, and Ruiz leaned in from the hall, and the quality of energy he brought into the kitchen brought everyone close without anyone being asked. He dropped his coat on the chair and went straight to the range to warm his hands and turned to look at Mabel, and he had an expression she had never seen on him before. Not the usual contained watchfulness, but something that was still controlled but barely. The look of a man who has been holding on to something for 9 miles in the cold and needs to put it down. "Aldous Webb," he said. "You were right that I should have gone a month ago." She stood. The note Crail brought, the personal note with Thomas's signature. Webb found the original filing in the territorial records. He reached into his coat and produced papers, creased, cold, handled, and laid them on the kitchen table. The note as Crail presented it has an interest rate of 11%. The original filing shows 7%. Someone altered the document between filing and collection. The kitchen was very quiet. "Altered it," she said. "Changed the number. Webb says he's seen it before with Pruitt's instruments. He says the original filings always tell a different story than what Pruitt's collectors present." Silas looked at her steadily. "The debt at the legal rate, calculated from the filing date, is $141, not $304. That's still—" she started. "There's more." He put his finger on the second paper. Webb also found the surrender documentation for the homestead, the one that accompanied Thomas's note. "There's a clause in it, a standard clause for Pruitt's instruments," Webb says, buried in the language, "that voids any associated personal notes upon surrender if the surrender is accepted by the bank as full settlement." He looked at her. Pruitt's bank accepted the surrender. She stared at the paper. "If the surrender was accepted as full settlement," she said slowly, "then the associated personal note is void," Silas said. "Webb's opinion. He wrote it down." He tapped the paper. "That's his written statement, signed, of what the records show." Denton, in the doorway, made a low sound. Mabel sat down. She looked at the papers on the kitchen table and she thought about Pruitt in the general store, about Victor Crail at her door in the blizzard, about $212 she'd been carrying in her body like a stone she was always about to drop. She thought about the payments she'd tried to make, the coins she'd pushed across that counter, the look on Pruitt's face as he pushed them back. "He knew," she said. "Pruitt. He knew the surrender voided it." Silas said nothing, which was confirmation. "He's been collecting on a debt that doesn't exist," she said. "Trying to," Silas said. "He hasn't gotten anything from you. You didn't sign anything with Crail." "Because I refused to." She looked at him. "What would have happened if I had signed?" "You would have formally acknowledged a debt that the records say doesn't exist, and then it would have existed in a different kind of way that would have been much harder to undo." He paused. "Pruitt knows that most people he collects from don't have access to the territorial land records. Most people don't know Aldous Webb exists. Most people sign what's put in front of them because they're tired and frightened, and the man presenting it has armed men with him." Ruiz from the hallway said quietly, "Son of a bitch." Nobody corrected the language. Mabel looked at Owen, who had been sitting very still at his end of the table through all of this, watching the adults with the specific attention he used when he was filing things away. "Owen," she said, "go to your room for a bit. I want to hear—" I know you do. Go. He went slowly, with Biscuit following at his heels. She waited until she heard his door close. What do we do now? She asked. She was asking Silas, but she was also asking herself, sorting through it aloud. Webb knows a territorial lawyer, Silas said. Man named Hargrove. He works out of the county seat. Webb sent a message before I left. Hargrove may already have the documents by tomorrow morning. He sat down across from her. We can present this to Crail before he gets back to Pruitt, or we can wait and present it through Hargrove directly, which is slower but cleaner. What does Webb recommend? Webb recommends Hargrove. He says going to Crail directly gives Crail time to go back to Pruitt and adjust the documentation, and Pruitt is creative with adjustments. She looked at the papers. She looked at them for a long time. Then she looked at Silas. You rode to Callaway Creek in a near blizzard, she said. The road was passable, he said. Barely. Barely counts. She looked at him and thought about what Owen had told her an hour ago, sitting at this same table, about Thomas and his fear and his pride and the things he couldn't bring himself to say. She thought about the ways people help and the ways they don't, and the difference between a man who holds back because he doesn't want the cost of being involved and a man who rides 9 miles in cold that gets into your bones and comes back with papers that could change everything. She didn't say any of it. She said, "Thank you." He looked at her the way he looked at things he was deciding how to handle. Then he said, "Don't thank me yet. We still have to get Hargrove in front of a judge." I know. She reached across the table and put her hand briefly on the papers, on the cold surface of the documents that Webb had found and Silas had carried. But thank you anyway. He didn't deflect it. He just looked at her and nodded once, and that was enough. Denton cleared his throat from the doorway. There's still coffee if anyone— Yes, Mabel said, already pushing back her chair. Sit down, all of you. There's bread left, and there's coffee, and— She stopped, looked at the men who had come in from their various positions around the ranch to stand in the kitchen doorway and hear what was happening. Denton and Ruiz and Fletcher, and even Yates was there at the back, by the outside door, not quite in the room but not outside it either, looking at the floor with an expression she couldn't fully read. Sit down, she said again. All of you. They sat, because when Mabel Harper said sit down in that kitchen, they sat. That had become the natural order of things over 3 months, and they followed it the way you follow something that has earned its authority. She put bread on the table and poured coffee and moved around the kitchen with the efficiency that was as automatic in her as breathing now. And when she came around to the end of the table nearest Yates, she paused. He looked up. You were right, he said, before she could say anything. She raised an eyebrow. About the supplies, he said. He was looking at the table, not at her, which was as close to graceful as a man like Yates got. Sending them to town. I didn't know about Mrs. Aldrich's grandkids. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about the several things she could say in response to this, and chose the simplest. Noted, she said, and poured his coffee and moved on. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, and it wasn't the end of anything, and Yates probably knew that. But it was forward, and forward was what there was. Outside, the sky had made its decision. Snow, light and tentative, beginning to fall in the particular way it falls when a storm has passed through and left behind only its cold afterthought. The ranch was quiet in the way it was quiet on evenings that had been difficult and were now, at least temporarily, not. The hands drank their coffee. Owen's lamp was visible under his door, and somewhere in the county seat, an old records keeper named Aldous Webb was sending a message to a lawyer named Hargrove, who had in his hands documents that told a different story than the one Gerald Pruitt had been telling for years, told it clearly, told it in the dry official language of territorial filings, in numbers and dates and clauses that don't negotiate with pride or shame or the particular power of a man who counts on the people he's wronging not knowing where to look. Mabel sat at the kitchen table with her coffee and her bread. She was eating the bread, actually eating it, without calculation. And she thought about what came next. And what came next was hard and uncertain, and would require a lawyer and a judge and a public confrontation she already dreaded. But the papers existed, the records existed. Someone had looked and found them and brought them back through the cold. That was something. That was, in fact, everything. Hargrove arrived on a Thursday, 12 days after Silas had ridden to Callaway Creek through the cold. He was not what Mabel had expected. She had expected a lawyer's lawyer, precise, dry, a man whose emotions had been professionally laundered out of him somewhere around his second year of practice. What she got instead was a compact man in his 50s with a beard that had been trimmed recently but not carefully, who came into the kitchen, looked at the stove, and said, "Is that coffee? Actual coffee? Or is it the kind that's been sitting on the heat so long it's become something else entirely?" "It's been on about 40 minutes, Mabel said. "That's acceptable," he said, and sat down without being invited, which she didn't mind because it was her kitchen, and she'd stopped minding that kind of thing from people who weren't trying to intimidate her with it. His name was Charles Hargrove, and he'd been practicing territorial law for 22 years, and he told them that first evening, been looking for a clean case against Pruitt's lending operation for the better part of a decade. "Clean meaning what?" Silas asked. "Meaning documented. Meaning the kind of thing you can put in front of a judge without it becoming a question of one man's word against another's." Hargrove opened his bag and laid documents on the table with the careful sequencing of a man who has organized his argument and wants it received in order. What Webb found in the territorial records is not one discrepancy. It's a pattern. He spread 5 pages across the table. 5 separate instruments. 5 different borrowers. In every case, the rate recorded in the territorial filing is lower than the rate Pruitt's collectors present at collection. In every case, the differential falls just below what would trigger a mandatory review. Mabel looked at the pages. She thought about the woman at the Ferguson place. She thought about Mrs. Aldrich's grandchildren. She thought about the coin purse she'd held out across Pruitt's counter, while he looked at her like she was something to be moved past. "He's done this to others," she said. It wasn't a question. "Consistently," Hargrove said, "for at least 7 years that the records can confirm." He picked up one page in particular and slid it toward her. "This is the filing that matters most for your situation. Webb's written statement, my certification of the territorial records, and a copy of the surrender document with the voiding clause highlighted." He put his finger on a paragraph near the bottom of the surrender document. "This language, right here, Pruitt's own standard clause, in his own instrument, in his own filing. He voided the associated notes himself when he accepted the homestead surrender. He then attempted to collect on them anyway." "Why would he include the clause if he planned to collect anyway?" Silas asked. "Because he didn't expect anyone to find it." Hargrove picked up his coffee. "The clause is buried in 4 paragraphs of dense legal language, and it uses terminology that doesn't mean much to someone who isn't looking for it specifically. Most people he collects from don't have access to the Territorial Records Office. Most don't know the records exist. Most are in enough distress when the collectors arrive that they sign what's presented and then spend years paying off a debt they legally don't owe." He looked at Mabel. "You didn't sign." "I refused to." "That saved us considerable complication." He set the cup down. "The hearing is scheduled for 2 weeks from Monday. County seat, Judge Ellison. He's honest, which is not something I can say about all judges in this territory, but I can say it about him." He looked at both of them. "I'll need Mrs. Harper to testify to what was presented to her, what was said, what she refused to sign, and why." "In front of the courtroom," she said. "In front of the courtroom." She looked at the table. She thought about standing up in a room full of people and saying what she knew, while men like Pruitt and Crail looked at her with the particular look she'd spent her adult life on the receiving end of. "All right," she said. Hargrove looked at her with something in his expression she didn't expect from a lawyer. Not sympathy exactly, more like respect offered plainly, without ceremony. "The fact that you kept records," he said. "The payment attempts, the dates, the amounts. Do you have those?" She went to the shelf where she kept the small notebook and brought it back to the table and opened it to the pages she'd filled in before arriving at the ranch. The careful accounting of every coin she'd tried to give Pruitt, every date, every refusal. Hargrove looked at it for a long time. "You kept this contemporaneously?" he said, "as it happened?" "I didn't know it would matter legally," she said. "I kept it because I needed to know where I stood." He looked at her. "This," he said, "is going to matter considerably." The 2 weeks between Hargrove's arrival and the hearing were the strangest Mabel could remember on the ranch, not because things changed, but because they continued. The work went on, the cooking went on, the cold went on. She got up at 4:30 and lit the range and made the bread and fed the hands and managed the stores, and the hearing existed in the background of all of it, like a sound she was learning to live with rather than brace against. Silas didn't treat her differently, which she was grateful for. He had a quality she'd come to understand and value. He didn't dramatize the things he'd done or was doing, didn't use them as currency in their daily dealings. He'd ridden to Callaway Creek and come back with documents and handed them to her, and then gone back to the work of the ranch, and that was the whole of it. What she noticed, and didn't speak about, was the way he appeared at mealtimes now, with a particular kind of attention to whether she was eating. Not pointed. Not the way a person draws attention to a thing, just a quiet awareness that she felt without being able to specify. He refilled her coffee before she asked. He handed her the bread basket without her reaching for it. She ate. She was eating, mostly. More than she had been, more than the habit had allowed for most of the past 2 years. It wasn't smooth or consistent. There were days when she stood at the range and made everyone else's food and felt the old pull toward emptiness, the familiar reasoning that she wasn't hungry, that there wasn't enough, that her portion could go somewhere more necessary. On those days, she made herself sit down anyway. She made herself put something on a plate and eat some of it. She didn't tell anyone she was doing this. It wasn't anyone else's story, but she was doing it in the daily private way that changes happen, not through revelation, but through the accumulated weight of small decisions made in the same direction. Owen watched her eat with the carefully casual attention of a child who has decided not to make a thing obvious, but can't quite stop checking. She caught him at it once and held his eyes, and he looked away, and then looked back, and she gave him a slight nod, the smallest possible thing, and he went back to his food. That was enough. The road to the county seat was passable by the Monday of the hearing, barely, in the way that things in Montana Territory in February were passable if you were willing to accept the cost of passable. Silas drove. Mabel sat beside him on the wagon bench. Owen, who she had arranged to stay with Denton at the ranch, a decision that had cost her a significant argument with an 8-year-old who had strong opinions about attending the hearing, was back at the Boone Ranch eating Denton's version of breakfast, which she had already established was inferior to hers in 3 specific ways she'd briefed Denton on before leaving. The county seat was larger than Callaway Creek, larger than she'd pictured, with the kind of modest civic ambition that frontier towns develop when they've decided they intend to stay. The courthouse was a wood-frame building with a painted front that had weathered badly over the most recent winter, and there were people outside it when they arrived. More people than she'd expected. She understood when she got closer. Hargrove was there, at the top of the steps, talking to a woman she recognized after a moment as Mrs. Aldrich. And beside Mrs. Aldrich, a man she didn't know who turned out to be the Ferguson Place's patriarch. And near the door, a couple she'd never seen who Hargrove introduced quickly as the Holloways, who had driven 3 hours from their homestead at the far end of the valley. They had all received letters from Hargrove. They all had their own versions of the story. Mabel stood at the top of the courthouse steps in the February cold and looked at these people. People who had been lied to by the same man, in the same way, using the same buried clause and the same altered numbers and the same armed men at their doors, and felt something complicated move through her that she couldn't have named cleanly. Not triumph, not yet. Something more like the feeling of realizing you have not been alone in a thing you carried like you were the only one. Mrs. Harper. Mrs. Aldrich came to her, hand extended. I want to say, what you started here, I didn't start anything, Mabel said. I just didn't sign. That's what starting something looks like, Mrs. Aldrich said, with a firmness that closed the topic. Silas, beside her, said nothing. She felt him standing there the way you feel the warmth from a stove, not looking for it, just aware of it. The hearing itself was not the dramatic confrontation Mabel had built up in the architecture of her dread. It was less than that and more than that simultaneously. Judge Ellison was a gray-haired man with the aspect of someone who had heard most of what could be said in a courtroom and had developed strong opinions about efficiency as a result. He ran the proceeding with the low-key authority of a man who has no time for theater and has made that clear enough that most theater doesn't try. Pruitt was there, with his own lawyer, a younger man who had the nervous energy of someone who had reviewed the documents the night before and not liked what he found. Pruitt himself looked exactly as he always looked, wide-faced, certain, with the particular confidence of a man who has never been held accountable for anything and has come to believe that this is because he has never done anything wrong, rather than because no one has had the right documents. He looked at Mabel when she came in. She looked back at him. She looked at him with the same steady attention she'd used at his counter in the general store, and she held it without flinching, and after a moment he was the one who looked away. She noted this. She didn't make anything of it, but she noted it. Hargrove presented the case with the organized precision of someone who has been waiting for this particular arrangement of facts for a long time and is not going to waste it. The territorial filings, the discrepancies in interest rates, Webb's written statement, the surrender document with the voiding clause, the other borrowers, their documents, their own notebooks and receipts, and careful records of what they'd been told versus what the filings showed, and then Mabel's notebook. Hargrove held it up. He read from it, dates, amounts, the specific words Pruitt had used when he pushed her coins back across the counter. You do better to think about how you're going to vacate whatever you're currently occupying. The courtroom had been doing its usual low-level murmur until that, and then it went quiet in a way that was its own kind of verdict. When it was her turn to speak, she stood and she answered the questions Hargrove asked her in the voice she'd used with Cord Yates at the dinner table. Even, not loud, not performing. What she had been told, what she had tried to pay, what Crail had presented, what she had refused to sign, and why. Pruitt's lawyer objected twice. Judge Ellison sustained neither. When Pruitt's lawyer cross-examined her, he tried a version of the approach she'd seen men try all her life. The small undermining, the suggestion that she hadn't understood the documents, that she was confused about the timeline, that a woman in her circumstances might reasonably have misread the situation. She answered every question precisely. She cited dates from memory and confirmed them against the notebook. She did not become flustered, and she did not become emotional, and she did not give him a single loose thread to pull. Afterward, sitting back down, she was aware that her hands were shaking slightly, and she put them flat on her knees under the table and pressed until they steadied. Silas, in the seat beside her, did something he had never done before. He put his hand over hers briefly, just for a moment. Not long enough to be a statement, just long enough to be what it was. She let it stay. Judge Ellison didn't deliberate long. He was a man who had done the math before anyone finished presenting it. His ruling voided the debt against Mabel Harper's estate entirely on the grounds that the surrender documents clause had legally discharged all associated personal notes at the time of acceptance. He ruled additionally that the interest rates applied across the other 5 documented cases were in violation of territorial lending statutes. He ordered a full audit of Pruitt's lending instruments to be conducted by the Territorial Records Office, covering all instruments issued in the previous 10 years. He looked at Pruitt over the top of his reading glasses when he finished. "Mr. Pruitt," he said, in the tone of a man who has kept a thought to himself for the duration of a proceeding and is choosing his last moment to release it, "there is a difference between what the law permits and what it tolerates. You have spent a considerable number of years exploiting that difference at the expense of people who could not afford the cost of your creativity. I expect you will find, as this audit proceeds, that the territory's tolerance has reached its limit." He closed the folder in front of him. "This hearing is concluded." The room held its breath for a moment and then released it in pieces. Pruitt left quickly, with his lawyer close behind, and whatever expression he wore going out, Mabel didn't see it because she wasn't watching him leave. She was looking at Mrs. Aldrich, who had her hand pressed flat against her sternum, like she was checking that her heart was still there. She was looking at the Ferguson man, who had bent forward with his elbows on his knees and was looking at the floor in the private way of someone who needs a moment. She was looking at the Holloways, who were holding each other's hands in the careful way of people who don't need to explain why. Hargrove came to her. "It's done," he said simply. "It's done," she said. "The audit will take time. And there will be other people who come forward when they hear about it, which they will, because news in this territory moves faster than weather. But for you," he looked at her, "it's done. The debt is gone. It was never valid. It was never yours." She had thought she would feel more when this moment came. She had been carrying it for so long, not just the debt, but the weight of being wrong, of being the kind of person debt happens to, of being what Pruitt's face told her she was every time she walked into that store. She had thought the moment it was removed would feel like the physical lifting of something. What it actually felt like was quieter, more like setting something down that you'd been holding so long you'd stopped noticing the tension in your arms until suddenly it was gone and you became aware for the first time of how tired your shoulders had been. She stood in the emptying courtroom and felt her shoulders drop about half an inch. Silas was beside her. "Ready?" he said. Yes, she said. Let's go home. She said it without thinking and heard it after she'd said it, the word home, and found she didn't want to take it back. Spring came the way it always comes to Montana territory, reluctantly, in stages, with several false starts, and at least one late snow that felt like a personal affront. But it came. The passes opened. The road to Callaway Creek became ordinary again, passable without calculation, and the ranch moved into the particular rhythms of a place waking up after a long dormancy. The audit proceeded through March and into April, and the stories it uncovered were not surprising to anyone who had been paying attention to the right things, though they were breathtaking in their accumulation. 14 families over 9 years, carrying debts that ranged from mostly invalid to entirely fabricated. Most of them had been paying quietly, as people pay things they've been told they owe and have no means to contest. 3 had lost property. Gerald Pruitt, facing criminal charges that Hargrove pressed with the systematic energy of a man who has been waiting to press them, settled the bulk of his assets before the end of April and left Callaway Creek in a way that was simultaneously abrupt and, for those watching, entirely unsurprising. Victor Crail, interviewed by the territorial authority, claimed he hadn't known the documents were altered, which was possibly true and made no practical difference. Mabel heard about all of this in pieces, as it happened, from Hargrove's letters and from Henry Marsh, who was a reliable carrier of news and who had taken to stopping at the Boone Ranch more often since the winter, a development Silas regarded with equanimity and Mabel attributed to the quality of her bread. What she was mostly occupied with in those spring months was the ranch. There was the practical work of it, which never stopped. The kitchen, the stores, the management of provisions through the seasonal transition. When what they had needed to last through winter was giving way to what was available fresh and what needed preserving against the next winter. She had started a kitchen garden on the south-facing slope beside the house, a project that Owen had annexed enthusiastically and that Ruiz had begun helping with in the mornings before his other work, silently and consistently in the way he did most things. But there was also a different kind of work, a conversation she and Silas had been having since February in the slow, non-linear way that conversations happen between people who communicate mainly through action and the occasional direct exchange when the action isn't enough. It had started with the partnership. He'd brought it up in March, on an evening when the kitchen was quiet and Owen was asleep and she was at the table with her notebook, revising the spring supply plan. He'd come in with his coffee and sat across from her and said, without preamble, "I want to propose a formal arrangement." She'd set down her pencil. "Not charity," he said, before she could. "The ranch is more viable now than it was before you came. That's measurable. The winter losses were bad, but we came through it with the herd largely intact and the stores managed. That's not luck. That's work, and the work has a value." She looked at him. "I want to make you a partner," he said. "Not an employee, not a housekeeper. A partner in the ranch. Specific terms, written down, reviewed by Hargrove if you want. Equal voice in decisions about provisions and operations. A share in the proceeds proportional to your contribution." He looked at the table. "I've been running this place alone for 4 years, and I've been doing it wrong in ways I didn't fully understand until this winter." "You haven't been running it wrong," she said. "I've been running it without enough people," he said, which amounts to the same thing eventually. She thought about it for a long time, in the silence he gave her without apparent discomfort. "I have conditions," she said. Something happened at the corner of his mouth. "I know you do. Owen's education. If there's money, he goes to school. Real school, not just what I can teach him. That's not optional." "Agreed. My kitchen management is mine, not subject to committee." "I wouldn't presume," he said. "You would. You just wouldn't mean to." She looked at him directly. "When you have opinions about the kitchen, you say them to me privately. I'll hear them. I won't always agree. That's the arrangement." He was quiet for a moment. "Agreed," he said. "And I won't be talked about on this property. Not by hands, not by anyone who comes through. That's your responsibility as the ranch owner to enforce because it's your ranch, and I'm telling you now that it's a condition." "I know," he said. "It already is." She looked at him. He looked back. They'd gotten better at looking at each other in the months since October. Less cautious, more willing to let the look hold for a moment before someone spoke. "All right," she said. Then yes. He reached across the table and they shook hands, which was both the right thing and slightly absurd given everything. And she thought she saw something in his face that was not quite amusement and not quite warmth, and was probably both. Hargrove can draw up the papers, he said. Good, she said, and picked up her pencil, and went back to the spring supply plan. But what? The harvest celebration was Mabel's idea, though she would not have called it that. She called it a practical occasion to use the garden's first yield before it turned, which was accurate and also not the whole story. It was June, properly warm for the first time since before the winter. The garden had produced more than she'd planned for, because Owen had taken the planting seriously, and Ruiz had taken the watering seriously, and the south-facing slope had taken the sunlight seriously. And the result was an embarrassment of early summer produce that she made into the best meal the Boone Ranch had seen since she'd arrived. She set the table in the yard. That was the thing she'd decided, looking at the kitchen and looking at the yard and looking at the evening sky coming on, outside. Everything outside. The big table from the kitchen carried out on Denton and Ruiz's reluctant but cooperative backs, set up on the flat ground near the garden, covered with the cloth she'd been keeping folded in the chest at the end of her bed. Henry Marsh came because she'd sent word. His wife came, a quiet woman named Pearl, who arrived with a jar of honey and an expression of mild astonishment at the spread on the table. Hargrove drove out from the county seat, which was further than it was convenient, but which he did without complaint, arriving with a bottle of something dark in a paper bag and the air of a man who has been making excuses not to come to dinners for years and has run out of them. Aldous Webb did not come, because Aldous Webb never went anywhere, but she'd sent a basket with Silas on his last trip to Callaway Creek, and the message that had come back with Silas, delivered in 2 sentences in Webb's cramped handwriting, said, "The beans were perfectly preserved. I understand now what the fuss was about." She understood that to be the highest praise an elderly records keeper was capable of, and she accepted it accordingly. The hands were there. All of them, including Yates, who had been notably quieter since February, and who had, in the week since, found small ways to be useful to her without either of them making a project of it. A fence post he'd fixed without being asked that had been letting cold air under the pantry door, a water barrel moved to a more sensible location. She hadn't thanked him effusively. He hadn't sought thanks. They had an understanding of the kind that doesn't require naming. Owen was everywhere. He'd appointed himself to a role he called official helper, which meant he was in the kitchen one minute and in the yard the next, carrying things, reporting on the progress of the bread, engaging Mrs. Marsh in a detailed conversation about her chickens that she appeared to find both exhausting and delightful. He was brown from the early summer sun, and his coat fit him now. She'd made him a new one in March, with the wages from the partnership agreement, and it had room to grow into, which she'd calculated carefully. She was back and forth between the kitchen and the yard as the meal finished coming together, carrying dishes, checking on things. The constant back and forth movement that she did without thinking. The work that was as much a part of her as her own hands. She was coming out of the kitchen with the last of the bread. When Pearl Marsh said to her, "Let someone else carry that, Mrs. Harper," and took it gently from her arms, and Mabel stopped. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the table in the yard. She looked at Hargrove arguing pleasantly with Silas about something to do with fence line law, waving his fork. She looked at Denton telling Owen something that was making the boy's eyes go wide. She looked at Pearl Marsh setting the bread down and taking her seat and patting the empty chair beside her for Mrs. Aldrich, who had also come, who had driven out from Callaway Creek with her grandchildren, 2 small children who had discovered the dog biscuit within 2 minutes of arriving and who were now both sitting on the ground with the dog across their laps in a state of mutual bliss. She looked at all of it, and she went inside to the kitchen, and she got a plate. She filled it. She filled it deliberately, not excessively, not performing the filling of it for anyone's benefit, but enough. The right amount. The amount that a person who has worked since 4:30 in the morning and will work again tomorrow deserves without having to argue for it. She came out of the kitchen with her plate and sat down at the head of the table. No one said anything dramatic about it. No one stopped talking or made a gesture. The conversation continued, the food was passed, the evening moved through its ordinary phases. But Owen, across the table, looked at her, at the plate in front of her, at the fact that she'd sat down before everything was done rather than standing until everyone else was served and eating what was left. and something in his face did something she felt across the table and wouldn't have been able to put into words. She picked up her fork. She ate. Silas, beside her, was talking to Hargrove about something, half turned away, but she felt the exact moment he registered that she was sitting and eating, and he didn't turn, didn't make anything of it. He just said something to Hargrove and then said something to her, a question about whether there was more of the squash. And she answered him, and the conversation moved on. That was all. That was enough. There is a thing that happens to people who carry too much alone for too long. Not just the physical weight of it, but the internal kind, the accumulated belief that they are the sum of what others have decided they are. It doesn't announce itself when it begins. It settles in quiet increments, each one small enough to seem like acceptance rather than loss, until the person wearing it can no longer remember clearly what they looked like before. What Mabel Harper had learned that year, and she was 34, which is young enough to still be learning the important things and old enough to understand that you have to pay for the lesson somehow, was that the most dangerous lies are not the ones people tell you directly. They are the ones you begin to tell yourself, in their voice, until you can't hear the difference anymore. She had believed she was less than she was, for so long that the belief had calcified into something she called realism. She had called her own hunger inconvenient and her own portion dispensable and her own comfort a luxury others deserved more. She had done it initially out of necessity, and then out of habit, and then out of something darker than habit, the deep accommodated conviction that she simply mattered less. She knew where it had come from. It had come from years of rooms that went quiet when she walked in, from Pruitt's face and Yates's voice, and 100 smaller versions of the same thing, delivered in looks and laughs, and the particular way people don't quite look at you, the erasure through inattention. It had come from Thomas, too, whom she had loved and who had loved her badly, not cruelly, but incompletely, in the way of a man who never thought to argue against the world's assessment of his wife, because it was easier not to, and who had, in his dying, finally said the thing he should have said throughout, and handed that confession to a 7-year-old to carry. She didn't hate him for it. She'd moved past the thing that had felt like hatred and found something more complicated on the other side. A grief that had room in it for his failures and her love and the full, difficult fact of who he'd been rather than the simplified version people become after they die. What she had found at the Boone Ranch, over the course of one brutal Montana winter, was not rescue. She wanted to be clear about that, though there was no one particular she needed to be clear with about it. It was something she clarified for herself, in the kitchen, in the early mornings before anyone else was awake, in the inventory she now did of different things than supplies. No one had rescued her. Silas had offered her work, which she had accepted on her own terms. Webb had found documents, which she had used. Hargrove had fought a case, which she had made possible by keeping records and refusing to sign. Owen had told her the truth, which she had been strong enough to hear. The hands had come around gradually, in the ordinary way people come around when they encounter competence and dignity, long enough that their initial assessment becomes embarrassing to maintain. What she had done was keep going. She had kept going when she was frightened, and when she was tired, and when the old voice told her she should take up less room and eat less food, and ask for less consideration. She had kept going through the blizzard, and the debt collector, and the courtroom, and all the smaller indignities that didn't have names, that were just the texture of being a woman who looked like her in a world that had decided what that meant. She had kept going, and she had turned out to be, as Thomas had finally told their son to tell her, the biggest person in any room she'd ever been in. She was still working on believing it. That was fine. Belief in true things sometimes lags behind the truth, and the lag doesn't make the truth less true. She ate her meals now. Not perfectly, not without the occasional pull toward the old diminishment, but consistently, in the way of someone who has decided that the decision is made even if the feeling hasn't caught up entirely. That was what she could say. Honestly, the decision is made. In the yard, the evening had gone soft and warm, the kind of June evening that makes Montana feel like a promise rather than a dare. Owen had fallen asleep in his chair. Not the first time, would not be the last. And Silas had carried him inside without waking him, which was a thing she'd watched from the table and which she would not have been able to say much about, only that it mattered to her and she let it. Hargrove was still there, talking to Pearl Marsh about something that had them both laughing, which was not a thing she'd have predicted when she looked at either of them earlier in the day. Ruiz had brought out a guitar from the bunkhouse and was playing something quiet on the far side of the yard. Not for anyone particularly, just playing. The kind of music that doesn't demand attention but fills the air pleasantly if you let it. Silas came back out and sat down beside her. He poured 2 cups from the pot that had been on the table and pushed one toward her and said nothing. She took it. She looked at the garden, at the yard, at the people still lingering in the warm evening. She thought about October and the coin purse and the empty plate and the 9 miles of cold road and the pantry she'd built from next to nothing and the notebook with its columns of careful numbers. "Next winter," she said. He looked at her. "We should start the supply list in August," she said. "Not October. August." He was quiet for a moment. "August," he agreed. She drank her coffee. The guitar played something that had no particular name. The summer dark came on slowly, the way summer dark does, reluctant and warm, and the first stars showed up in the east with the tentative quality of things that have been there all along and are only now visible. She sat at the head of the table with her coffee and her full plate and her son asleep in the house behind her, and she did not think about the woman she had been when she arrived here, or not only that. She thought about the woman she was still becoming, in the ordinary daily way of it, one early morning and one honest meal and one clear-eyed decision at a time. That was how it worked. Not in a single moment of arrival, not in a courtroom ruling or a legal document or any one thing, but in the accumulation of mornings you chose to get up for, and meals you chose to fill your plate at, and words you chose not to swallow back down. One at a time. Forward. That was all it ever was, and it turned out to be enough.